And welcome back to those of you who joined our previous conversation today on covering two political leaders who have treated journalists as the enemy, US President Trump and Indian Prime Minister Modi. The next panel will look at the challenges of covering the biggest election of the moment, the 2020 US presidential elections. John of The Guardian US will moderate the discussion with Sally Buzbee, Senior Vice President and Executive Editor of the Associated Press, Tia Mitchell, Washington correspondent of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and Stephen Engelberg, Editor-in-Chief of ProPublica. The conversation, you can join the conversation by posting your comments in the chat box and asking your questions through the Q&A box. On to you, John. Thank you.
Thank you, and welcome to this discussion about how the journalistic community can better cover the 2020 election, perhaps, than it may have done in 2016. And I want to start with that question because there were a number of criticisms that were made about the way in which the so-called press covered the 2016 election, and that certain communities were said to have been left out. And also there was a sense that Trump was given a free pass, that his entertainment show wasn't checked sufficiently, and that he stole a lot of the oxygen, and it imbalanced the way in which the press presented the debate. There were also issues over the degree to which the press collectively believed the polling. Some of those errors in the way polls are audited have been corrected, but how many of those? So I thought we would just start, and I wanted to ask Sally, in light of the kind of thinking that went into the post-mortem around 2016, did you make any specific changes to the way you set out to cover this particular election?
Yes, I mean, I think we did. And then I think the reality is that the pandemic and the events around the pandemic made us make a lot of additional changes, some of which were in response to that. So I would say a couple things. First of all, yes, I think that the media, including ourselves, was caught somewhat flat-footed by Trump's approach and his aggressiveness. We ramped up our fact-checking, I think, somewhat in the middle of 2016, and I think it has ramped up extensively over time while he was president and going into this election. And I think that's generally true across the board. I think the polls are another major issue, I would say. For our part, so I think there have been some improvements in the polls. I do worry, though, that there are still some risks. The U.S. has a unique system. Winning the popular vote does not mean you win the presidency. And I see in coverage still now, and try to fight against this every day in our own coverage, some susceptibility to some of the same polling mistakes that we saw in 2016. So I do think that I think anyone who's predicting the winner at this point is taking a lot of risks to do that, I would say, okay? Because the biggest uncertainty in the United States is what turnout will be. And that is enormously difficult to predict, I just think. And that's one of the biggest problems that any polling, no matter how good it is, has, okay? The other major change, and this was imposed upon us, is that the pandemic has caused, so the United States was moving toward remote voting, whether that was early voting or mail-in voting. The pandemic has accelerated that normal demographic change, which was already happening. I mean, like 10 years of acceleration in a couple months. So many of the states are struggling to make sure that they can actually effectively administer the elections. And our coverage is very focused on that because that has become an element of this election, I guess I would say. So those are sort of, I'm just scratching the surface, but those are the three big changes that I would flag.
And Tia, you're at the front line of covering the Trump-Biden election. The same question to you, and in particular, what pressure do you come under to try and put guardrails over the statements that the president makes every hour on Twitter or every day at his press conferences, which we now know to be like essentially a platform for misinformation. And what conversations have you had with your senior editors and with your colleagues about how best to both report, but also to in some way invigilate on the, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, the endless succession of lies that come out of the White House?
So it's really interesting because what I'm finding as someone who writes for a regional paper, the paper in Atlanta covers Georgia. And so we have to take what the president says and apply it to a Georgia audience. But what we find also is that our Georgia elected officials take what the president says and they use it for their own campaigns and their own political messaging. And so context is very important. You know, you can't let elected officials say what they want to say in a vacuum. And even if they kind of try to color a comment about, for example, we know there have been protests over racism and policing. And from the right, we see those protests have been shaped and colored in a way that is not always accurate. So we as journalists, you know, we can't change what they say, but we can give it that context and give it a fuller understanding. So those who read what the president says or what someone who supports the president says, we give them more accuracy. And that's something I stress to my colleagues, particularly as a Black woman. And I tell them, you know, I've said to my colleagues that we can't just in our mind say, look at President Trump, look at all the crazy things that he says, or look at these crazy, weird things. It's not just talk. You know, I can make a direct connection between something that is shaded by racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and attacks on the street, the uneven enforcement of policing on communities of color, anti-Semitic attacks. So it's not just words. And that's why it's even more important that we put it in context and try to give as much truth to these words.
And Tia, how do you feel when you see other news organizations covering the president without that context and without talking directly about the impact that these words have on people living in different communities? I mean, do you despair about where some parts of journalism is heading? I mean, do you come across colleagues who perhaps write for some of those outlets? Do you have conversations with them about their responsibility, not just to journalism, but to the communities being impacted by what has been said by the White House?
I have conversations with whoever will listen, but I will say most of my focus is on, you know, my outlet and making sure that AJC is as accountable and as responsible as we can be. So I tend to focus my energy on my colleagues, and then probably the newspaper industry is the next rung. I will say though that that's one of the things that is hard from a media literacy standpoint, because not all outlets are created equal. Some outlets are more dedicated to the truth. Some outlets are more dedicated to accuracy. Some outlets are more dedicated to balance. And it's about helping readers and consumers of the news understand the difference. I think social media also muddies it, because you'll see journalists who are covering, for example, a press conference or a rally by the president, and they repeat his lies to elevate them, the president's, you know, lies or mistruths, but don't give them the context in the same social media post. And that can be frustrating, because then the misinformation or the disinformation gets spread without the context. And it's hard, you know, on social media, on Twitter, when you only have 280 characters, but that's why us journalists have to be careful even how we share what we report.
Stephen, this is a related question for you. I mean, ProPublica are obviously less kind of invested in the hour by hour and day by day reporting. But related to what Tia was saying there, I wonder what your thoughts are about the in the decreasing space there is in America for a kind of conversation in the center, because we know that people are moving to extreme positions, and they're sometimes being driven there by algorithms on Facebook, which if you sign up for a lockdown protest, before you know it, you're going to be invited to a QAnon group. And you have an environment where it seems, and I'm overgeneralizing, but there are two tribes, neither of whom speak to each other, and neither of whom ever have an environment in which they can talk to each other. And you might characterize that as Fox on the one hand and MSNBC on the other. And I mean, how can journalism penetrate an environment, no matter how investigative and truthful its reporting is, when you have large numbers of people who apparently believe that hospitals are inflating the number of COVID cases in order to get state money? I mean, that's accepted fact in places. QAnon is taking root in a rather extraordinary way. And of course, there's a candidate in Georgia that we could talk about later. Wildfires in Oregon, again, an accepted truth that they were started by Antifa extremists, and the police had to issue a statement to say there is no evidence of this. I mean, do you again kind of despair about the impact that journalism can have in an environment that is that fractured and that siloed and that tribal and sectarian, where people cleave to their own truth? And what could we possibly do to break down some of those barriers?
Well, a couple of thoughts there. First of all, of course, you're right. Social media has done a sort of extraordinary job of dividing America, and in fact, dividing people all over the world. These algorithms are not unique to our political system. In that sense, this is a new force. But what I like to say about the internet is it doesn't really invent anything new. It just raises it to sort of an industrial level. It isn't like in high school in America, students didn't gossip about each other. They just weren't able to post it to the entire high school. You know, we are a country, for the European audience who's listening to this, I believe at one point, certainly in our lifetimes, John, 1/3 of Americans believed Elvis Presley was still alive. And I think close to 1/3 believed that aliens, you know, were coming and extracting human beings from the planet. So we're not, you know, people being stuck in beliefs is not a unique thing to America, and people's belief in conspiracies is not new. But yes, this social media environment, it's remarkable. I mean, I have a side bet with somebody that with all the New York Times revelations about the president paying $750 in taxes, when the dust settles, he will stand at 41% in the polls, that it will move not one person either way. And so that is a striking thing if you're in my line of work, which is investigative reporting. One of the things we did post-2016 was try to step up our coverage of issues. We felt that, you know, people in watching the sort of bread and circuses of Donald Trump hadn't paid enough attention to the sort of significant change he could bring to their daily lives. So we have tried to write stories that look at things like healthcare or trade policy or even the judiciary. I think some people read those. They don't change as many votes as we want, I would say, because I would hope that people would read things and be influenced by our work. But let's be clear. This election is going to be decided by a relatively small percentage of people who live in a relatively small percentage of American states. Some of those people are going to be changed by what they see. Certainly not as many as we journalists would like. People are going to watch 75% of voters say they're going to watch the debates tonight. Well, how many will change their mind? Not very many. But remember, the last election was actually won, 63 votes, a million votes cast on, you know, both sides, actually won by about 100,000. So you're not talking about that many people. So I still think it is possible to write stories that influence things and change things. If I didn't, I'd be lying in bed right now, sort of with my covers over the head. So I'm hoping that, yes, journalism still matters.
I do think, let me just weigh in for 1 second. I do think the question you asked, John, is really the question of this age. And I agree with everything Stephen just said. I just want to throw out one other part. The thing that we struggle with is, again, we try to obviously do strong journalism, investigative and spot news that fact checks in real time and all that kind of stuff. But I think there is another layer, which is that the country of the United States right now is so riven by polarization that some people just tune things out, okay? I mean, I made a bet about the Trump tax stuff with the New York Times too, and, you know, do people think that the New York Times is liberal and so therefore they will not read even fabulous investigative journalism that is clearly accurate? In fact, there was a lot on social media that was like, these are fake, he didn't really get the tax returns. So we face an enormous burden of, if people think that we're from one side or the other, they're just going to tune out and not pay attention to even the world's best journalism, right? So what we're struggling with is, how do we present that journalism in a way that is strongly accountable of the president and all other politicians, that is issues-based, that is fact-checking, but is also accessible to people, so that they don't just say, oh, it's the AP, they're East Coast liberals, I ain't reading any of that, right? And I mean, that's my biggest challenge and struggle right now. I think it is the biggest challenge and struggle and there are a lot of news organizations in the US that have become more partisan. And so that middle ground, how we plow that middle ground, is honestly what I think I'm going to spend the rest of my work life on, is how we do that. And I don't have easy answers. We have a lot of things. We put more context into stories. You know, when the Republican convention happened, we wrote a line that said, the Republicans accused Joe Biden inaccurately of wanting to defund the police in the United States. I just got floods of mail from people who said, Biden does want to defund the police. And I realized that people don't take our word for it anymore. We have to put the attribution and the facts into the stories. If we say Biden does not want to defund the police, there's a whole body of people in the United States who just don't believe us. We have to actually kind of shove the facts into everything we're doing with attribution. And that's hard. So it's changing how we're approaching, back up your work. People aren't going to take what we say for granted anymore. All of that is happening in real time, and we're trying to figure out solutions in real time.
And a related question, Tia, for you. Both Stephen and Sally have talked about partisanship and the kind of cleaving to one's own kind of tribe. And I wonder to what sense you're feeling that the ground has shifted over the last 4 years. Because I know, in speaking to Guardian reporters, they've been really struck over the last 3 months about how deeper the animus is, both between groups of supporters and also towards the press. And it's not obviously unique to the press. We had a piece yesterday about a small community, tiny hamlet in upstate New York, which had been torn apart by, sign warfare. Somebody had put a Black Lives Matter sign on their lawn 3 months ago, and it had caused unbelievable kind of ructions within a tiny community. And the toxicity at a local level, forget what's happening on Fox News or Breitbart, it seems to have seeped into almost all people's lives in America. And I wonder, as a frontline journalist here, what you or your colleagues are telling you about what it's like to be out there on the sidewalk, trying to speak to people and trying to engage in them. How would you calculate that kind of level of animus, and whether it's possible to bridge the gap and have conversations with people?
Well, it's funny you mentioned it's not about Fox News and Breitbart, but unfortunately, even down at the local level, it kind of is, because particularly in rural America, where you have news deserts, you don't have daily papers. Daily papers are closing at a swift pace, and they're not being, unfortunately, in many parts of rural America that already leaned conservative, their news outlet is Fox News, and it's continuous, and it's full of misinformation and disinformation, and that's all they have, unless they seek out other outlets. And then, of course, Fox News has told them that outlets like the AJC and like the Associated Press and ProPublica are fake news, so that doesn't help the discourse even on the local level. Also, I think we have to, at some point, if the American people want it to be better, they're going to have to demand better from the entire industry. And there isn't necessarily a framework to ensure, again, all organizations are not cut from the same cloth. And until there's standards that the people at home hold media organizations to, there's always going to be organizations that are incentivized to peddle in the misinformation and disinformation that influences people, because unfortunately, that's what they realize sells. So on the ground level, it is, you know, I wrote about a poll recently, and we had poll questions about the protests and about police brutality and racism. And I just reported poll results, and I interviewed people who participated in the poll about how they feel. And I got emails from people saying, how dare you write about this? This is racist. The reporting on the poll results is what's racist, not necessarily the views reflected in the poll results. And so that all comes from the same place, but it all trickles down. And, you know, during the coronavirus, we're not, you know, I think that's also, we're more polarized than ever because we're literally in our own camps and in our own corners. So even less than before, people are not interacting with strangers. They're not interacting in a literal way with different viewpoints and different people. And so I don't think that helps either, but that's just, you know, a reflection of this current time.
Yeah. And Stephen, to pick up on something Tia talked about there, which is the, you know, it's an old story, but it remains an important one, which is the growing number of news deserts across the US. And I know ProPublica has offices in different places, and you try as best you can to do quite a lot of collaborations with local news organizations. I mean, from where you're looking, is there any light on the horizon in terms of the challenges that news organizations, and particularly local news organizations, are facing? A lot of academic studies over the last 2 years showing just how many places have lost their particular source of local information.
Well, I have a funny experience, which is that I am on the board of my local weekly, which we are now turning into a nonprofit. And I think this hit me the other day with sort of blinding clarity. It's not a new insight, but you know, in America, for many, many years, democracy depended on the following proposition, which is essentially in a state or a city, you would go to a merchant and you would pay a penny or two more, and that merchant would use that penny or two to buy advertising that supported journalism. And now we want people to pay a good bit more than that penny or two to support journalism. It is a transition that we have not made. And so, you know, if you look at NPR or the Associated Press is a collective, NPR is a nonprofit, they remain the only real sort of answers to this news desert problem, because the old way of the penny on top of your shirt or your hardware store purchase just doesn't work. It is going to entirely disappear over the next 10 years. There will be things that rise up to take its place. And as Tia points out, readers, citizens have to demand a certain level of competence and fairness from those outlets, because otherwise, what are we going to see? And what I fear we're going to see, frankly, is a mini Fox News is everywhere. Because let's face it, Fox News is not an ideological proposition purely. I think Rupert Murdoch agrees generally with what gets said. It's a commercial proposition. There has been money in acting like this. And as long as that's the case, and as long as we are in a purely profit-making space, then there will be money on radio, online, on television in doing things like this. And, you know, will the American people, will the citizens rise up and demand better? Tia, I hope so.
Sally, I wanted to talk to you a bit about something we touched on before we started this conversation, and it was the idea that more focus than ever is going to be brought to bear on the kind of the state of democracy in the US, because we'll look again at the Electoral College. We talked about the Senate and how unbelievably unrepresentative it is of America. And sometimes, and for our European colleagues, I mean, just a couple of stats about the Senate. And in our focus on Trump and Biden, you know, it's important not to lose sight of the importance of the Senate, because a large amount of Biden's legislative program, if he were to win the White House, but not win the upper chamber of the Senate, a lot of that would be dead on arrival. And just a couple of points about the Senate. 50% of America lives in 9 states, so they're represented by 18 senators. The other 50% live in the remaining states, and they are represented by 82 senators. So over here you have 50% of the population, which is broadly diverse, both politically and racially, in the sense that you have big states like Texas, Florida, which might be considered Republican, and New York, California, which are Democrat. So they have 18 senators represent them. This other 50% is much less diverse, and it skews towards white older voters in rural parts of America and the Midwest. And I wanted to, Sally, for you to talk a little bit about how this election may be the one that fixes a kind of laser stare on some of the problems that are baked into American democracy. And that's before we get into all kinds of litigation in the days and weeks after the election.
Right. So I think what I would say is this is a very messy process. But I think it is possible to look at what is happening in America. It wasn't all the good old days, okay? There are large demographic changes. There are people who want representation who historically were not represented by the institutions that we're talking about. And that is happening. There is enormous demographic change, that is essentially changing what America looks like going forward. I think you can read some of the events of the last, whatever you want to say, decade or more, as resentment and backlash against that, in terms of people trying to hold on to power when a lot of the actual demographic change in the United States is at some future point going to make some of this probably pretty inevitable, right? I mean, now that said, it seems to be happening slower and more messier and much more, not violently, but I guess I would say stridently and bitterly than maybe some of us anticipated it was going to happen, okay? We talk endlessly about, if you look at the state of Georgia, eventually it will turn blue. It still keeps voting for, Republican presidents, okay? The demographics seem inevitable, but they, the people who are on the losing side of the demographic battles in the United States are fighting back hard, let's put it that way. And they're very smart politically. And to your point, to answer your question, the structures built into the Constitution sort of, support their point of view. I mean, the way the United States was set up, there's not direct vote of the president. There's an electoral college, and it is based on states. And so, yeah, if you vote for the president in California, your vote doesn't really count. I'm sorry, it just really doesn't. Whether you go to the polls or not, it really makes no difference. Whereas if you vote in Wisconsin, your vote is precious. I mean, and there have been studies, some really good journalism that have shown, the House of Representatives should be Democratic if we had one man, one vote. But because of gerrymandering, that's not the case. The Senate is one of the sharp points. To me, the two biggest sort of, to say this in a neutral way, the two institutions where one man, one vote, or one person, one vote is the least real in America are the U.S. Senate and the Electoral College that elects the president, okay? So Are we going to see reform on those underneath questions? I don't know the answer to that. But there's a lot of progressive energy in the United States, and I don't know if it's this election or in the future. It seems like now what the Democrats are focused on right now are things like put more people on the Supreme Court or end the filibuster in the Senate. Those are structural changes. They are, though, I think, more tactical structural changes. They're not getting at the underlying, and they look more partisan for that reason. You see what I mean? They don't look like we're trying to improve American democracy. They look like we're trying to win. So I will say that I think this kind of depends on, this. There are a lot of people who thought this is the year when the demographic change takes over. Don't know the answer to that yet. At some point, some of this stuff is going to start changing in the United States, but I don't think we know at this point. My personal view is we don't know at this point exactly when.
Right, and the ability of the Republicans, I think, to have had a very, very long-term strategy and to have set in place roadblocks should not be underestimated. Our Supreme Court in the United States currently is 9 people. 5 of the members, I believe, as of today, have been appointed by presidents who finished second in the popular vote. And if Trump is reelected, I think that rockets up to potentially 8 out of 9. You see how the systems that we have interlock with each other, and the minority has a substantial set of levers to pull if they hold the right positions, if they get the courts in their hands, if they have the state legislatures. And so, you know, you can certainly slow down this demographic change. How do you do it? You take away polling places. You sabotage the post office. You take people off the rolls. You stop the census count a month early. All of these things are levers that can be pulled to delay the inevitable. I mean, there is an inevitable here. I mean, I know Steve Miller felt like if I just stopped all immigration, maybe we could reverse this, but that's not going to work because the people who are already here will have children and the other people will eventually die out. And, you know, over the sort of decades long horizon, the changes in America are not going to be reversed, but they can be delayed.
And I think, you know, to me, this reminds me that so much of, you know, how our government was set up, we have to remember it was set up by white men who at the time did not visualize an America that looks the way it does now. You know, that was a government set up by white men who, at least in the short term, envisioned white men running the government. They envisioned white men being the ones who voted for the elected officials in government. And so, as Stephen said, the demographic shifts make some things inevitable. We're seeing that in Georgia. We're seeing seats in parts of the state that were ruby red just, you know, a few years ago, electing Democrats, and the blue center that is Atlanta, Georgia, is expanding into the suburbs in ways that, you know, are inevitable, but because of the foundation of our systems, preserving white supremacy, and because there are people even today that want to preserve those strongholds, to the other panelists' points, they are able to use the system to preserve that. And that's, I mean, and we have to, even when President Trump says, make America great again, and those who talk about preserving the old nostalgic way of life, you know, that's coded language for a time in our history where not everyone was treated equally under the law. And so I think that's what's sometimes hard for people perhaps watching this who aren't as familiar or didn't grow up in the American government system to know. It's rooted in these things. Racism and white supremacy are rooted in our government, are rooted in how so many systems operate in America. And yes, there are ways to change that, and things have changed over the years. But because some people are invested in stopping those changes for their own political interests, not always racism, but their own political interests are in preserving these racist and white supremacist systems.
John, if I could just jump in. Go ahead, Sally.
I just want to ask Tia something related to that, and just for Tia to talk a tiny bit about how that kind of you know, gaming the demographics takes place in Georgia. I mean, Georgia is the poster girl and poster boy for voter suppression. And there was a point after the 2018 governor election where it seemed as though that theme, because of Stacey Abrams' focus on it, was going to become something that we talked about more. I mean, Tia, I wonder if you would just talk about, again, for people perhaps living outside of the US who don't understand the lengths that the Republican Party go in order to preserve power when the kind of demographic changes are lapping at their door. And if they were to be fair elections, they would be swept from power. But redistricting, gerrymandering, and particularly voter suppression, and particularly in places in Georgia, have managed to preserve their power. And I wonder if you would talk about that as somebody who reports now for a Georgia newspaper.
So gerrymandering is a big one. If you look at everything from the congressional seats to state house and state senate, gerrymandering allows to pack certain districts so that Democrats are overwhelmingly represented in certain districts and not as well represented in others, which makes them easier for Republicans to win. And that's why Democrats are very focused in Georgia on winning seats in the state legislature so that they can have a bigger voice in the redistricting process in 2021. But also, as you pointed out, the gubernatorial election in 2018, where Stacey Abrams got very close for a Democrat running statewide. You know, it was very unprecedented what she accomplished, but we know she didn't win. And there are things as ranging from, you know, how they judge absentee ballots, you know, signature matches, purging the voter rolls. More recently in Georgia, there's debate on whether, you know, some judges, because so many people are voting by mail, and we know there have been issues with the Postal Service, existing law says your absentee ballot has to be received by Election Day. And some voting rights groups have challenged that. And a lower court judge has extended the deadline to say if they arrive, you know, within a few days after Election Day, they can be counted as long as they're postmarked by Election Day. Well, the Republican Party has appealed that ruling, and so it may not stand. You know, this morning there's a special election to replace John Lewis for the remainder of his term. He died in July. There was a precinct in Atlanta, nobody was there to open the poll on time. You know, that's a management issue.
Wow.
And the county election office is run by Democrats. So there's finger pointing in Georgia as well, because you have counties that are run by Democrats, Fulton County in Atlanta, DeKalb County, which is also part of Atlanta. They're run by Democrats and they have all the problems. But what they don't have is perhaps the level of coordination and support at the state level run by Republicans. And so it's part of the management of elections even becomes partisan in Georgia.
Right.
Sally,
I mean, one of the things we're seeing is that Americans took their system for granted for a long time. Okay. And I do think, I don't know if this is a source of pessimism or optimism going forward, but I do think people need to get serious about exactly the kind of thing that she is just pointing out right there, and demand from their elected officials that elections are run well. Elections in the United States are enormously decentralized, right? The states will not give up their power of running these elections. But I think that one of the possibilities going forward is that citizens, you know, become much more aggressive about demanding that elections be run well, because that is one of the issues. You know, one thing that I just want to say very clearly, Trump right now is creating a narrative that delay means corruption. As someone who, you know, the AP helps tabulate the vote across the whole country, I just want to say very clearly that delay does not equal corruption, okay? Delay might actually, in the United States, signal that state elections officials are being careful and precise and counting all the votes very carefully and precisely on election night, okay? And that they're taking the time to make sure that their counts are correct. And so one of the biggest, really, honestly, and we've fact-checked this a million times, so I'm not saying opinion, I'm saying fact.
Yep.
It is not accurate to say that a slow election count in the United States is a sign of fraud or corruption. That's just not true. And that is my single biggest worry going into this, is there's going to be a vacuum before the results are known, unless it's a blowout. And, you know, people need to have some patience and some civic duty and patience to wait for these counts to happen. And that is a source of pretty much daily angst for me about how that's going to go down in the United States. So.
Well, that leads us to the first question we're going to take from viewers, and any of you can come in on this. It speaks directly to what will happen once the polls close, and it says, what are the challenges ahead for journalism once the ballots close, and how might American journalism prepare for this? We know that the president has set the ground for what he is calling a rigged election. He said outrightly last week, the only way we can lose is if the Democrats rig it. You may have a scenario where Trump is doing well at about 4 a.m. Eastern time, because a lot of the ballots that were cast on the day are more likely to be Republicans, and a lot of the ballots that have yet to be counted because they were sent by mail are Democrats, because Democrats have been asking their voters to vote by mail. He may conceivably have a lead at 4 a.m. He might take to the podium. He may declare himself a winner, and that all of the outstanding ballots that haven't been cast yet, who knows? They've been rigged and they're lying in a warehouse, and we can't. That's not American democracy. We need a decision tonight. What will American journalism do to try and see that this election plays out? So that all ballots are counted. Anybody can take that.
Well, let me start and then throw it to others. What we intend to do is to aggressively fact check that in real time and say that you know, by going on camera, by having experts go on camera and say, we tabulate the vote, all of the vote has not been counted yet. And so this is a fake claim. The US presidential election is not decided if it's not, okay? We also intend, you know, we call races. We are always enormously careful about that. We have like a 99.9986 accuracy rate over the last 20 years or something like that. We are going to double down on precision and accuracy and care. There are a lot of things that could slow down, you know, if it's if someone on either side wins by a large margin, then it's a very easy race to call. If it is a close race, it is likely to be a while until the winner is 100% accurately known, okay? And our level of care will be extraordinary on that. I think the networks feel the same way from what I've heard them say publicly. And so I think the most likely scenario this election night, unless there is a blowout, is that it will be very slow and precise. And then people will have to essentially contradict, if the president makes a claim like that, they will have to contradict him in real time and say, no, the vote's not counted. I don't know what, you know, there's no indication that other people in the Republican Party will speak up. And so the press will be thrust into the role of having to do that, I believe.
And I think also journalists need to be prepared for a lot of litigation at all levels. You know, that's something we experienced in Georgia in 2018 after the governor's race. Stacey Abrams spent almost 2 weeks. Stacey Abrams and other voting rights groups spent almost 2 weeks challenging how absentee ballots were counted, challenging, you know, even on the night of the election, filing emergency lawsuits to keep polls open later because lines were long. And so there were a lot of small court battles, even at the local level for, you know, congressional races. And that's something that we should expect, particularly in places where, as Sally mentioned, that it might be really close. You know, I was a college student in Florida in 2000 during Bush v. Gore. And so this can go all the way to the Supreme Court if some states are close. And that's why that Supreme Court fight we're hearing so much about is so politicized, because we know that the Supreme Court, how it ruled on Bush v. Gore, had an impact on the outcome of the presidential race that year. So that's something that we have to be on the lookout for. And that means we have to be precise and accurate in how we shape not only the issues raised, but the true stakes of these various small legal battles that might pop up. So I think that's in the short term after Election Day. I also think journalists are going to have to pay attention to the transition, particularly if there's a change in the presidential, you know, seat. If Joe Biden wins, we'll have to pay attention to how Donald Trump handles the transition, as well as if Democrats win control of the Senate, what that transition looks like, knowing the power in the hands of the U.S. Senate.
Yeah, I would just jump in too and say that I'm a little bit older than you, unfortunately, so I was given the job of coordinating the New York Times investigative and enterprise coverage of the Florida election. And I sent 13 reporters to Florida like at once. And it was an incredibly difficult, complicated story, and it was only happening in one state. So I think we have to prepare ourselves. I'm sure Sally has contingency plans for multiple states hanging in the balance. And, you know, unfortunately in Bush v. Gore, which I think most Supreme Court followers would tell you is one of the worst decisions in the history of the court, the 5 Republican appointed people voted one way and the 4 Democrats voted the other way. And people argue that that election was decided by one vote. And so are we going to see that again? And I think, look, that's the polling certainly is not definitive. We learned a lot about polls, as Sally points out, from 2016, but the polling suggests that if the election were held today, there is going to have to be some kind of strategy for Trump other than winning the votes in all the states, because it seems unlikely that he is going to get what he needs the sort of straight ahead way. But, you know, just to really blow people's minds on this thing, you should know that if the whole thing gets undecided somehow and we end up in January, the House of Representatives in America decides, but the House of Representatives votes by state. And as John has already pointed out, the states are not a very good measure. And I think that would be a 26-22 vote in favor of Trump. So just in case you're really worried about undemocratic scenarios, we have lots.
And just thinking about the logistical and legal kind of chaos that might descend, and not all of it is going to be kind of birthed on the right, because even today we have a story about absentee ballots that were delivered to thousands of people in Brooklyn by the New York State Board of Elections, and thousands of these have been sent to the right people, but the return envelope has the wrong name on it, so that you would in effect potentially you could be in legal difficulty if you cast that ballot. And at the moment there are many people in Brooklyn trying to get hold of the New York State Board of Elections. If you call, you're told that there's 87 people ahead of you. Now that's happening in New York, a Democratic-run state. It's apparently an error by a printing operator, but again, given the number of people who want to vote by mail, I mean, if that's happened here, one can only assume that there are going to be multiple other issues that are logistical as opposed to legal ahead of the election. And I wonder how much thought you're giving how you cover that in the run-up to the election.
So we're giving a lot of thought to that. I mean, you know, that is, I mean, Stephen is right. We have enormous contingency plans to essentially cover, so for example, after the election, legal challenges in every state, okay? I will say that New York State does actually have kind of a bad record of good voter administration. That's a little bit like counterintuitive. Generally speaking, the biggest election administration problems in the United States are in poor states and southern states, okay? Because the poorer the state, but also southern states, unfortunately, have just, you know, bad track records. Some of that is, as Tia says, you know, for political reasons, not for, and, you know, the Northwest is kind of the gold standard of good, strong election administration. Not coincidentally, they were the first people to do mail-in voting, which in fact is, of course, in some ways, you know, creates greater access, obviously, okay? So, but New York State does have a pretty bad track record, which is a little counterintuitive. We have enormous worries about this. I think that the pandemic, which is not, you know, it's not a political event in this sense. It just has created that people don't want to go to the polls and they want to do mail-in balloting. So the states are grappling with probably 15 years of change around mail-in balloting in the space of about 7 months. And many of them are doing an excellent job, really trying hard to do that, okay? And there are problems that are emerging. I will say that one mildly hopeful, tiny little hopeful, sort of incremental hopeful thing is that the primaries that first did mail-in balloting were a mess, okay? And the primaries got better and better run over time. So it seemed like the state election administrators were actually sharing best practices and learning from each other. There was some evidence of that, okay? But there are two big problems. Delaware had one of the latest primaries. It's a tiny state, and they were a disaster on mail-in balloting. And so that scares me, because if Delaware can't get its act together, oh my God, how do we think South Carolina or Pennsylvania or Texas or Colorado or any of these, or Michigan, you know? And then Tia makes an excellent point that I really want to flag. Some of these legal fights may resolve themselves 5 minutes before the polls open. And how is a state election administrator actually going to be able to deal with that? I mean, to be fair to these people, if the courts are making decisions, like they're still fighting in Pennsylvania and Texas over how the election will be run. So then whenever that gets resolved, then the state has to scramble and get its paperwork in place. So there are a lot of things that are kind of scary out there. The only other thing, you know, that I would say is there is some, and I think we are either on the verge of writing a story about this or have already done it, I don't know, but there is some pretty strong evidence that Democrats are using mail-in balloting and Republicans are doing so at a much less strong level. So then mail-in balloting does become politicized, because that, you know, it shouldn't be politicized. It's just a method of voting, for God's sake. But that is going to be one of the things we're going to have to unsort for people on election night, because there's some pretty strong empirical evidence that, like, the numbers are out of whack. Like 2/3 of Democrats in the primaries were taking, you know, and they're requesting And Republicans are still hanging to going to the polls, although some of them are mailing. So it's the level of explanatory, clear journalism we are going to have to do leading up to Election Day, on Election Day, and after Election Day is intense. And we're focused on it, but we're going to be as transparent as we can possibly be. But I think everyone in American journalism needs to join hands and try like mad to support each other through this process, honestly, I think.
Okay, so lightning question for our panelists. Are you going to vote in person or mail? I was going to vote by mail, but now in person.
I think what I'm going to do is request, I like voting in person, but I usually early vote. So not on Election Day. I haven't voted on Election Day in quite some time. It's not easy, as a journalist, it doesn't make sense. I think what I might do this year is request an absentee ballot and use a drop box to vote. So essentially it's the same as early voting, but I already have my ballot with me when I arrive at the precinct for early voting.
That's really smart. I also requested an absentee ballot. If it shows up with mistakes, then I'm going to early vote in my neighborhood before Election Day. So that's my plan.
So you see, we don't trust the damn thing either.
But what Sally talked about in terms of that story is what we talked about earlier, where if the percentage of votes that have been cast by mail are mostly Democrat, and the percentage of votes that are cast on the day are mostly Republican, and it allows Trump, he's already casting huge doubt on what he calls the ballots, although he has asked people in to vote by mail because he wants elderly people to come out in support of his party. But if that is the case, and we're guided by Fox News coming out and making a decision at 4 a.m. based on the ballots that have been counted, I have to hope that that doesn't happen. There is an enormous possibility that into the vacuum, while we wait for all of those ballots to be counted, and it could take days and days, a narrative is established that they're illegitimate and that he's in the lead and he is the rightful new president. And I don't know how you counter that as a news organization, but
so
you've spoken to that.
Let me say two things. One is we're planning to go on air and say the ballots haven't been counted on election night if necessary. We've never done that before. We are trying to move up to a level of transparency that is new. Secondarily, I just want to be somewhat fair to Fox News. While you are right that all of the on-air talent on Fox News is likely to do what you said, Fox News does have a news division, and their race calling operation is actually quite accurate.
No,
okay,
that is true.
So I do think that's, I don't think there was a fairly well written article by Ben Smith in the New York Times last week talking about their race caller. So.
No, I absolutely. I would clarify that the decision desk is an absolutely empirically driven operation that will make a non-political judgment about who's leading the race. It's more that Hannity and Carlson and others will start a narrative, some of their commentators. But yeah, absolutely accept the decision desk is above reproach in terms of what it will do. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Sally.
Your basic point is right. The narrative could be created, and I think we all feel an enormous responsibility as American journalists to try to stand up for facts, whatever those facts are. If the current incumbent wins the presidency, I can guarantee you the AP will call the race for the actual winner. If Trump wins re-election, we will call Trump as the winner. We will make our decisions and our journalism based on facts. I believe the Atlanta Journal-Constitution will do that. I believe ProPublica will do that. People need to seek out credible sources of factual journalism.
Tia, a question for you, which is, this is obviously an extraordinary election in all kinds of ways, and it has made some reporting on the ground difficult. And the way in which both parties are canvassing and campaigning is different. The Republicans are not observing social distance. They're broadly going out and door knocking. The Democrats have been much more resistant to doing that. And I'm wondering, how can journalists kind of properly calculate whether or not there's a momentum in the Democratic campaign? We speak a lot to Trump reporters. It's an overhang from 2016 to try and get back out to those communities to see if they're sticking with them. we've done much less on what may or may not be happening amongst the Democratic constituency. And if we think about 2018 and the midterms, it was an extraordinary rebuke of Trump from large constituencies of people, not least candidates of color and women of color and communities of suburban women and communities of color. I mean, it was an outpouring for the Democrats. Have we got any sense, Tia, from who you're speaking to, that we can expect a similar kind of drive and momentum behind the Democratic vote? I mean, Biden may not be the most inspiring candidate, but despite that, what are you hearing about the kind of mood on the ground among Democrats?
Yeah, it is more difficult, this year, because it's not just that candidates aren't campaigning. Even Republicans, even though they are doing more in-person events, really only Donald Trump and maybe rural Republicans are doing those big events. But for the most part, most Republicans, even they aren't doing the town halls and the voter forums and those events that usually we could use to get a sense of who's gaining momentum and who's resonating with people on either side. And so what we've had to do is we are doing polling, and we're being very transparent about what polling does and does not tell us, because to me, that was one of the main kind of missteps in 2016, is that people were, it's not so much that the polling was off. The polling was off sometimes, but our interpretation of the polling was what was off. Polls are not an end-all be-all. They are a snapshot in time. They are statistical analyses using, a finite group of people. And so I think that wasn't explained as well all the time. It wasn't always put in the proper context. So we're doing more of that this time. I will say that journalists in general struggle with getting outside of their bubble. And you hear a lot about how journalists in 2016 didn't talk to middle America and didn't talk to enough of those white conservative evangelicals. Well, guess what? Journalists didn't talk enough to people of color and communities of color either, because if they did, they might have understood the difference in the enthusiasm gap with Hillary Clinton and where that came from, and why Black voters were perhaps not as motivated as they had been for the previous 8 years under Obama. And so it goes both sides. What I'm hearing from a lot of communities of color this year is that by and large, they do not want another 4 years of President Trump. And I had a friend literally say, if it's Biden and a billy goat, that's who gets my votes. I don't care, back when it was, who will be his vice presidential nominee. There's just a lot of motivation amongst so many groups that are not white Christian American to not have another 4 years of Donald Trump. And we have to be clear about that. Donald Trump's base is very narrow. That doesn't mean he can't win, because again, we talked about these voter systems that make white Christian American kind of the default constituency in America, and a lot of systems make that so white Christian American voters have an outside voice in American politics. But the fact remains that a lot of other constituency groups are invested in not seeing another Trump term, but we know that it's motivation and actually casting a ballot and actually having your ballot being counted are what we're going to be looking at in the following weeks.
A question here again from the audience, and do remember that you can send your questions in, which I will put to the panelists. I have a question here, and it asks, what can US journalists learn from international journalists covering elections in emerging democracies? And I presume that by that they mean the kinds of issues that we've talked about, where there is a issue cast over the legitimacy of elections. And I don't know if anyone wants to take that question.
Sure. Well, first of all, I would say, in fairness, the United States is an emerging democracy, but we have hope that we will become one. It's going to happen. Second of all, I mean, I do think that all of the social media things that we saw in the Philippines, in Brazil, and frankly in Britain, are worthy of paying attention to in a great level. I will say that 16 is different from 20. In 16, it was Facebook ads. Today, it's Facebook groups, which are much harder to access. But yeah, no, I think we have a lot to learn from those elections, and to call us a fully emerged democracy, I think, is an overstatement.
I mean, I very much think that my time overseas has made, my ability to understand how to cover what has happened in the United States much easier, right? Because what the United States is happening is it thought it was stable, and now it's kind of drifting into some, real serious problems, okay? That's slightly different than a country that didn't have good civic institutions and is struggling to get them, but a lot of the same lessons do apply. So one of the hardest things to do is actually cover voter intimidation, because you kind of have to actually be there to see it, right? Because you can sort of probably assume that both sides are going to give you kind of a half-true, thing of things. So what we're doing is a lot of things like, we have lines into the NAACP on election night to tell us, where are you seeing problems? Where are you seeing problems? So that we can get journalists there and try to get eyewitness accounts. Also, to be fair, our audience requires, eyewitness information now to believe things. And so we want to be able to get cameras there to actually register what's happening if there's really sharp examples of, which I think there are going to be, of voter intimidation and stuff like that. But that all means, news organizations, we don't have as many people as we used to. I mean, we've got lots of people still. We're very lucky. I don't mean to say that, but we certainly don't have as many. We still have a footprint in each state. We are at this moment in time, what I'm going to do right after this call is figuring out the best way to arrange that footprint in the states to make sure our reporting is as robust as possible, including as much video and visual evidence as possible on election night. As a news manager, that's what I'm focused on. Our reporting has got to be robust, comprehensive, firsthand, as much as we can make it. All of that is hard. So that's what we're focused on, is just the nitty-gritty of how we do this.
Another question, and you may feel as though you've already covered this, but another question, anybody can take this. What mistakes does the press continue to make in covering this government?
I would say, we still struggle sometimes with playing both sides too evenly, and you have to call a lie. You have to call racism, racism. And I also think, again, American media see the default lens as white America. And so anything that's outside of that default lens is sometimes too quickly to be described as not the norm. And again, that's institutional, and that's something that American media is grappling with now, is to, when you make white the norm, then everything else is seen as abnormal, and as opposed to just saying white is an identity just like everyone else, and allowing that nuance no matter what. It shouldn't be white is the norm and everything is abnormal. So those are the things that I think journalism in America, particularly in a political lens, has to keep working at.
Another question here from the audience, the virtual audience. Isn't the problem that all kind of potential legal challenges end up being political issues? That there is in fact no separation between the law and politics, because the people who should decide are politically nominated. And of course, last week in the deliberations that were taking place about whether the president should rush to fill the vacancy before November the 3rd, Ted Cruz, the Texas senator, was explicit in saying, the Republicans have to fill the vacancy by November the 3rd, because this election may be decided by the Supreme Court, and we need to have 6 against 3. Now, that's a perfect expression of the issue that this Ole, who has asked the question. I wonder if Sally or Stephen want to take that. Look, we all know how the president has politicized the courts. He's made record numbers of nominations, not just to the Supreme Court, but to so-called lower courts, which hear thousands of cases that impact on people's everyday lives, whether it's around right to choose or LGBTQ issues or education. Trump's court takeover is potentially his his biggest legacy, whether he wins or not on November the 3rd.
Yeah, and that is obvious. Oh, go ahead, Stephen, you go first. Go ahead.
No, please.
Yes, and I think that is very much the case, that the United States is becoming, the courts are becoming more politicized. I think that there's no question that trend is happening. I think that is also a sign of danger that many of us see in the United States. There's no question about that. Okay, an independent judiciary that is not politicized, I think, is what generally agreed to be one of the core. I mean, that's rule of law. That's a core component of a stable society, democratic or not. Okay, but it certainly is stable. It's a core of a democracy. I don't know that it is as bad. It's way worse than it used to be. I don't know that it's 100% bad. I think that this is something that people are worried about. I mean, for example, I can't tell you what would John Roberts do if he has to decide the election? Is he going to do a pure partisan vote, or is he going to try to protect the integrity of the Supreme Court long term? Personally, I think that's one of the more interesting questions in America right now. And I think there's some evidence that he cares about the reputation and integrity of the Supreme Court. But I can't answer that question. I think that's a fascinating question.
I mean, I think the problem is that they strongly suspect he would vote, call it as he sees it, rather than politically. And that's why they want, a ninth justice, a reliable ninth justice.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, yeah, I mean, this is one of the big struggles in the United States going forward. I think there are a lot of I want to be clear that I think there are a lot of federal judges in the United States who do not make decisions based on politics.
Yeah, no, but just to talk again about the number of judges that the president has appointed, I think he's now appointed almost 25% of the two main courts below the Supreme Court. And they, as I said, hear thousands of cases. And we talked a bit about how the Republican Party managed to hold on to power when demographically it would suggest as though they should lose power. Well, one way to continue to have an impact is to appoint mostly white, younger men to positions of legislative power, which they will hold for 20, 30, in some cases 40 years, having a material impact on people's lives across the country. And that is the point, I think, where the democratic deficit begins to become very glaring, where you have a politically appointed judiciary which is completely at odds culturally, politically, demographically with the people over whom it is casting kind of judgments on their behalf. Well, look, I think we should wrap it up soon. I'm going to wrap it up with one question to all of you because we're nearing the end of our time. And let's talk about the only question that matters over the next few hours, which is the first televised debate between Biden and Trump. Tia, how do you think this is going to play out, and will it have any impact anyhow?
I think it will have minimal impact unless one of the two candidates really, really surprises people in a negative way. So, of course, we know President Trump is unpredictable. He, in the past, has been even in debates. He hasn't necessarily just gone full Trump in a debate in a way that has really embarrassed himself. But we never know on any given day what version of President Trump we will get. I think that if Biden performs how he has been performing in debates, which is middling as well, and Trump performs as he is in debates, which is middling as well, I really don't think it'll have much impact beyond a few sound bites, that resonate on the cable news for a few days.
Sally or Stephen?
The only thing I would add is I think all the risk is actually on Biden's side. I just think that's the reality of the situation. I mean, if Biden does poorly, and I don't want to be quoted on this, but I think our political analysts say this. I think there's a lot of risk on Biden's side if he does poorly. So he needs to do well, I think. I do think there are a very, very few undecided voters in America, but I do think there are probably some people who disapprove of Trump and yet secretly want to vote for him because that's what we saw in 2016, whether we like it or not. That was pretty evident. And so I do think one of the big questions is whether people who disapprove strongly of Trump, but still kind of might vote for him, whether they vote for him or not. I think that's one of the few still things that's still on the bubble. There are very few undecided voters in America. And I think that is probably the overriding thing. So it probably won't impact that much. But I think there's some risk to Biden if he does poorly.
Yeah, I would fully agree with that. I mean, I think what we've seen in the last 3 or 4 months, typically in America, there's a big bump after a convention. Didn't see that. I predict again to you that there will be no bump over the tax thing. I just think he's got 41%. And, I think Sally's absolutely right. And, if Biden performs very poorly, that could grow to 43%, but it's not going to 50, and it's certainly not going to 20.
Okay, look, I think we will wrap it up there with 2 minutes to spare. I want to thank Tia, Sally, and Stephen, and to thank the IPI for hosting this debate. And let us just hope that we have as close to a fair and reasonable election as possible over the next couple of months. Thank you all.
Thank you.
And thank you, John, also from IPI, and thanks to Tia, Stephen, and Sally for this extremely interesting discussion and for helping us understand the immense challenges that you are facing and covering the upcoming, but also the need to rethink how you're doing journalism to reach the audiences. Thank you for that.